So as I said, we're going to be taking a look at some of what's in this great book, The 7-Day Circle, The History and Meaning of the Week by one Eviatar Zerubbabel. And the reason that this is interesting for me, the reason that I want to go into it with all of you, and I hope you'll bear with me reading from the book in just a bit. I'll try to keep it from being too dry and boring. The reason I wanted to go into all of this is because there's quite a bit of this sort of harebrained social engineering going on these days. And frankly, there doesn't seem to be any shortage of it. You know, we have attacks on free speech. What I mean to go through here is a number of examples of the ways in which, like a worm gnawing at the roots of Yggdrasil, these utopians are really just chewing into everything, screwing everything up, trying to MacGyver everything that is ancient and often worthwhile in our culture. So they have attacks on our American institution of free speech. They like to call it the heckler's veto. I'm working on other ways to characterize it. It's a subject I'm giving some thought. I'm thinking I like the term blood tantrums. Then there is the invading and politicizing of childhood. Factors manufacturing factions, guaranteeing a lifetime of discord. The politicization of childhood, deeply a horrifying thing. Attacking the golden rule itself is another thing the utopians like to get after, which is to say reciprocity. And it recently occurred to me that, you know, this idea of reciprocity, it's getting quite a bit of discussion, and it should, but it occurred to me that reciprocity is really what the golden rule is all about. And so attacks on a solid cultural valuation, or a culture's valuing of, I should say, reciprocity, it all really amounts to an attack on the golden rule. And it seems to me, I mean, call me fucking crazy, what do I know? They call that the golden rule for a reason, don't they? So, yes, all these ill-advised Commie social engineering programs. There is the attacking of responsibility itself, the elevation of victim status, something I'm sure all of you are well familiar with. There's also the phenomenon I like to call pet culture. Tim brought it up long, long ago in one of our chain smoke discussions, and it really just stuck. You know, he's talking about how he likes working dogs. You know, he doesn't keep pets. And you can only keep a certain number of pets. In one of my old clips, you know, I show some footage that was pulled from some sort of news program doing a kind of Jerry Springer thing, going into some poor black woman's house. And she obviously had mental illness issues and was keeping rats, but they had bred with one another. They lived in the walls. They sprinkled everything with rat shit. They crawled over every surface. They bit her. They ran across her dining room table. I mean, they were literally everywhere. It was absolutely vile. The one blessing was that you couldn't smell the house by watching it on video, thank God. And that's the sort of pet culture we have. I'm a little concerned about going too far into it, because I think it will come across as too negative, too judgmental, too hateful. But it's one of the things that is being fostered, and ultimately, like the worship of victim status or aspiring to victim status, it amounts to an abdication of responsibility, a war upon responsibility itself. Pets are never held to account for what they do. Pet comes from the French petit, and it's like the old expression, come here, my pet, you know. Petite, a little one. One who is not responsible for what they do. Oh, Sparkles just crapped on the floor. You know, Mittens just puked up a hairball right in the middle of my pillow. There's no responsibility. They're a pet. They can't be expected to undertake or cleave to any kind of responsibility. They can't. So there are all these sorts of things, like I said, what I like to call blood tantrums, the heckler's veto, politicization of childhood, these other things, attacks on responsibility, attacks on reciprocity. It's all part and parcel of the ongoing Jacobin, commie, socialist, progressive experiments, all their social engineering undertakings. So all of these things could be discussed at length further, and some of them I may well discuss further. These examples that I just pulled at the opening of this discussion are taken from my notes, different ideas that I am working on. For those of you who are just coming in, I'm going to be discussing Commie machinations, attempts to re-engineer our society by attacking the roots of our most ancient traditions. In this case, we'll be looking at two examples. The attempt to do away with the 7-day week and thereby to go after things like shared culture, to create a balkanized population, to try to shut down Christianity, to keep factories more productive. These are the kind of things that motivated the attempt to get rid of the 7-day week, and we'll be looking at two examples of it. One from the period right in there after the French Revolution, before Napoleon came to power, when they attempted to institute decades, weeks of 10 days. And then the Russian attempt under the Bolsheviks, and I can't remember the Russian word. Let me see here. What do they call their 5-day weeks? Good God. Neprerivka. At any rate, we'll be discussing both, that by way of orientation for those who are just now joining us. So I am going to concentrate on the week now as an example of some of the worst of their attempts to change our traditions. So this week is our way of dividing time. Our 7-day arrangement has been around for quite some time. If you ask a Christian or a Jew, it's been around since at least the creation. There were 6 days of creation and a 7th day of rest. The 7-day week certainly existed in Judaism, as is evidenced in the Old Testament and other Jewish writings that have come down to us. This in turn might be related to an earlier arrangement with time cycles, maybe going back to ancient Mesopotamia. They don't have a proper 7-day week, but there are monthly cycles where they like single out the 7th day, I think the 14th day, the 19th day, the 21st day, something like that, and the 28th day. So it's almost maps onto a 7-day cycle. But there's nothing in the ancient text from Mesopotamia that suggests that we have this arrangement of 7 days that correspond to planets and the rest. So this relationship with 7 days can be seen in the word week itself, which in many languages either means 7 or is related to the word 7, the earliest unmistakable indication of a repeating week of 7 days can be identified in Jewish scripture. As I said, somehow the ancient Babylonian stargazers observing 7 planets in fixed order, and the Egyptian chronological practice of dividing the day into 24 hours, each associated with one of the 7 planets, somehow all of this yielded the week that we still observe today. So there's the ancient Mesopotamian whatever, there's the Jewish tradition of dividing it into 7 days with the day of rest, and then there is this combination of possibly influenced by this Jewish stuff. I mean, there was a whole lot of overlap between the Jews and the Greeks in the Hellenistic period, which is what we're about to get to. Somehow all of this came together, the 24-hour days associated with the planets being seen as being in a fixed order. All of that somehow comes together following Alexander's conquests, which many of you will recognize as being the Hellenistic period. It possibly originated in Alexandria and probably dates back to the 2nd century BC. So that's around the time that we get this whole system of 7 days of the week and having them each associated with a planet. Now that system made its way into Rome about 100 years later. And by the first years of the 3rd century AD, the Roman historian Dio Cassius observed that the astrological week had spread to all men. So this way of dividing up the months and the years into a fixed and inflexible week of 7 days has been widespread across the West for almost 2,000 years. Turning now to the late 18th and early 19th centuries, in the case of the French Revolution, the former, and the Bolshevik Russian shenanigans, the latter. The problem with the week for these guys, for these utopian progressives, was that it included Saturday and Sunday. You didn't have a big thing with the whole Muslim focus on Friday. A bit possibly in the Russian Empire, but the main thing that they were, or what the Bolsheviks laid claim to and took over. But the big focus was that Saturday and Sunday were fixed days of rest for Jews and Christians. So the problem for these revolutionaries was that the 7-day week included days when people left off working and went to worship something other than the state. And we can all see today how that's a big no-no, right? This got in the way of their total control of their cult, of their great socialist experiments. And so the week had to go. It's just another historical example of the way in which Jacobins, commies, progressives, and other utopians just can't leave a single fucking thing alone. They have to dismantle every traditional element of culture they can get their dirty little hands on. So I want to read from this book to share with you these two examples of utopian cultural monkey wrenching, the Jacobin one and the Bolshevik one. Because like almost all progressive schemes, both were total failures. Of course, their miserable track record never dissuades them. They'll be taking down statues. They'll be remaking holidays or introducing new holidays. They'll be creating whole new theories of gender. They just can't get enough. So let's read a bit together. Let's walk down memory lane to review two of their more ridiculous failures. You really have to think about how they're trying to change racial and ethnic demographics and how they're trying to change the behavior of racial and ethnic groups, how they're trying to change cultural habits and all the rest. We have one program after another. They just are always coming up with this crazy shit. And what I'm trying to illustrate here is that in one case, going back to the late 1700s, early 1800s, and then in another one, the beginning of the 20th century, we get to see their little programs and how it all goes. So bear with me as I read, ladies and gentlemen. This is from Eviatar Zerubbabel's very interesting book, The 7-Day Circle, The History and Meaning of the Week. We start with the French 10-day decade. On December 20th, 1792, the new assembly ruling France, the National Convention, authorized the Committee of Public Instruction to consider a general reform of the existing calendar. The committee essentially adopted a proposal originally made 4 years earlier by Pierre-Sylvain Maréchal and proceeded to recommend the establishment of a new calendar based on 12 new 30-day months, each of which would be divided into precisely 3 10-day weekly cycles called decades. In 1793, only 5 days after the committee had presented its report to the convention, the official Journal de France discontinued its practice of dating issues using the traditional day of the week. 3 weeks later, it began designating days by the committee's newly proposed names: primidi, duodi, tridi, quartidi, quintidi. You get the point, all the way up to decadi. So it's day 1, day 2, really inspiring. Day 3, ooh, hard to figure out. Day 4, boring, rational. Rational in the sense that commies claim their innovations are, which of course leaves out any of the need for allowing the intuition in. But here I am going astray. More significantly, on October 6th, the convention had resolved to fix all public officials' days of rest on decadi. That resolution became an official decree on November 24th, the day the entire new revolutionary calendar was put into effect. A child of the Enlightenment, the French Revolution was supposed to inaugurate a new age of reason, as a symbol essentially representing its true spirit. The new calendar was thus expected by its architects to help promote clarity and precision and substitute the reality of reason for the visions of ignorance. It was by no mere coincidence that some of the eminent scholarly authorities they consulted, including mathematicians and others, were also members of the committee that had just introduced the metric reform of the traditional system of measures and weights. And I just have to say here, the metric system is cute. I get it. They want to make it rational. But you know what? The whole base 12 thing, the idea that the joint of the thumb is about like an inch, which means I can use my fucking thumb joint to measure. The idea of a span, a measurement I carry with me, a cubit, a measurement I carry with me, a foot, a measurement I carry with me, a yard, which is roughly equivalent to a stride. All of that shit makes sense because I am the measure. Man is the measure of all things, not because I'm the ultimate whatever, not to get involved in all kinds of crazy anthropomorphization of the good, if I can say such a thing, but because I myself am the thing experiencing everything. I become the measure. I put my hand out before me. I am the one who can reach out into manifestation and change things. And so systems of measurement that are based on my body make the most sense. So not only did we have them screwing around with the week, as we're going to hear more about, but they had to go in and institute this whole new decimal system to be oh so rational. So we can group things by 10 instead of a dozen, which means we can't divide it by 3, 2, we can't divide it by 3, 4, and 6. We can only divide it by 2 and 5. Like all these innovations that are so rational that we get rid of the dozen, which we've had in folk traditions for so long because it fucking makes sense. Anyway, where was I? I think I lost my metric system. The French Republican calendrical reform was essentially an extension of the latter, of the reforms related to measurement, and the day was to become the functional analog of the meter and the gram. The new system of units of time was largely based on the decimal principle, which is one of the cornerstones of Western mathematics. Along with the introduction of the new 10-day week, the reformers divided the day into 10 hours, each of those into 100 decimal minutes, and each of the latter into 100 decimal seconds, so that practically all the new units of time shorter than the month were interrelated in decimal terms. The architects of the reform were fully aware of the tremendous symbolic significance of that. Oh yes, just as aware as they are today of the tremendous symbolic significance of getting our little girls to imagine that they're little boys and our little boys to imagine that they're little girls. Again, my apologies for the aside. So when trying to legitimize the introduction of the decad, they were careful to emphasize the clear reason underlying the rational and scientific decimal system, particularly in contrast to the supposedly superstitious astrological basis of the 7-day week. Not to mention, 2,000 years of tradition associated with the 7-day week. Superstition, mere superstition. The real target of the reform campaign, however, was the Christian, rather than the astrological 7-day week, and from a symbolic standpoint, the abolition of the 7-day beat expressed the wish to de-Christianize France far more than the attempt to make life there more rational. Crazy, surprising. It's almost as though they've always been about power. Whereas the traditional calendar had been associated with the priesthood and with Catholic superstition, the new calendar was supposed to be a civil calendar, divested of any religious associations. As Maréchal had originally proposed, the calendar of the French Republic, the calendar of the French Republic must not resemble in any respect the official annuals of the Apostolic and Roman Church. It is therefore hardly surprising that his original reform proposal, his Almanach des Honnêtes Gens, had actually been burnt by the Bourbon government as impious, sacrilegious, blasphemous, and tending to destroy religion. So during the period commonly known as the Reign of Terror, which always seems to be associated in some fashion or another, whatever name it goes under, with all of these fucking commie experiments, During the reign known as the time commonly known as the Reign of Terror, the French Republic made great efforts to obliterate the 7-day rhythm, which was associated symbolically as well as practically with church attending practices. Churches were allowed to open only on decadi, and citizens were forbidden to close their stores on Sunday and wear their habits du dimanche, Sunday best, I suppose. However, while systematically destroying the traditional 7-day rhythm, the revolutionary authorities were also busy trying to have it replaced by an alternative weekly rhythm based entirely on the rational decade. As soon as the revolutionary calendar was put into effect, they introduced a new set of civil holidays into French public life. New holidays. There's always more coming, folks. It's like the camel's nose in the tent. Eventually, the Bedouin's outside, the camel's inside. You know, spoiler alert. These holidays were all based on this new weekly rhythm and were appropriately called decadal festivals. For those of you who are just arriving, I'm looking at the decades, the Jacobin attempts, the Utopian radical freakazoid attempts to do away with the week in France after the French Revolution. And then I'll be looking at the 5-day arrangements in the Bolshevik experiment in Russia in order to look at ways that these fucking commies and Jacobins are always trying to remake our societies. So I'm reading from a book on that. Hopefully everyone is tracking with me. Don't forget to hit the like button. Don't forget to check to make sure you're subscribed. So some of these holidays were already celebrated in late 1793, yet the idea that every décade would be celebrated is associated with the rise of Maximilien Robespierre to absolute power in 1794. On April 6th, a day after the introduction of a new civil religious cult was first recommended by the Committee of Public Safety, and also the day on which his arch-rival Danton was executed, he proposed that decadal festivals, to be celebrated on successive decades, be established on a regular basis. Then on May 7th, he issued a decree introducing 36 decadal festivals, corresponding to the 36 decades of the new calendar year, each of which was to be dedicated to some abstract idea, such as patriotism or filial piety. The celebration of the Festival of the Supreme Being throughout France on June 8, 1794, with Robespierre himself presiding over the festivities in the gardens of the Tuileries, was supposed to inaugurate this new annual cycle of weekly festivals, the observance of which was to be based entirely on the new 10-day rhythm. As a functional substitute for the church's Lord's Day, decadi was essentially part of a decadal religion and was to be celebrated in holy temples of the state. Put that in your pipe and smoke it. And was to be celebrated in holy temples, opening and closing with the singing of hymns. The only significant difference between this new 10-day weekly cult and the 7-day weekly cult, which it was obviously supposed to replace, was that it was to be consecrated to the French Republic rather than to Christ. Thus, for example, the hymn that would close the celebration of Decadi was the patriotic L'Hymne de Marseille, which would later become the French national anthem. Oh, the secular state. It persists in France, does it not? Mais oui, certainement. It took 4 years, however, before Robespierre's dream actually came true. Oh, I can skip all that. I'm reading too much. The decree, To be sure, during the Reign of Terror, the authorities compiled lists of heads of families who did not participate in the decadal festivals. Do it or else. Socialism, it's the right thing to do. Those who did not participate in the decadal festivals and Sunday observers were condemned as non-Republicans, as well as dangerous enemies of liberté, égalité, and the poor. However, legal sanctions against those who defied the decade were usually not enforced. That was to change dramatically in 1798, when severe fines and even jail sentences were applied to such violations as opening one's store on decade. Or closing it on Sundays that did not coincide with decade. The laws of 1798 made the closing of all stores, government offices, and tribunals, and public as well as private schools on decadal, as well as on quintidi afternoon, mandatory. The dominance of the new weekly rhythm was also felt in commerce, as all fairs and markets were fixed on particular days of the decade. The laws also prohibited the use of the traditional designations of the days of the week in journals, contracts, and posters. That's right. As a part of their reform, it had to become forbidden for you to mention or use in any kind of official document or post publicly the old fucking days of the week. Keep this in mind when you hear people like, what's her name, the sleazy green new squeal, Alexandria Fluffluffla. This is the kind of shit that they love. Historically, they do it over and over again. The Directory's main goal was obvious: to pull the entire social and economic life of France outside the sphere of the traditional Christian weekly rhythm, so as to make the latter absolutely irrelevant to daily life. Just as we would find it most difficult, as we shall see later, to adhere to a 10-day rhythmic pattern of activity in a social world dominated by the ubiquitous 7-day beat, so would the French find it almost impossible to even keep track of the days of the 7-day week, when almost their entire affairs would be regulated by a 10-day rhythm of activity. Furthermore, how would anyone be able to preserve the traditional Christian way of life and attend church regularly every Sunday when stores could be closed only on decadis and quintidi afternoons? Similarly, given that fish markets were only held on duodi, quintidi, and septidi, how would citizens be able to keep eating fish every Friday? The cunning commies. Same shit, different century. Again, and again, and again, and again. They don't stop. Swoons. Pardon me, ladies and gentlemen. Happens with live streams. The manner in which French citizens were supposed to celebrate the decadal festivals, which began to reappear at least since January 1798, was formally spelled out in yet a third law, which the Directory passed on August 30th, essentially reintroducing rites that had been practiced back in 1794, yet which had never been enforced as mandatory. This law revolved around the decadal reunion, a patriotic celebration of the French Republic that was to take place regularly every decade, as Robespierre had envisioned it. Since the new weekly rhythm associated with the cult of France was essentially meant to be the functional substitute for the traditional weekly rhythm associated with the cult of Christ, some parallels between the weekly celebration of the French Republic's every decade and the traditional weekly celebration of the Lord's Day every Sunday might be expected. And indeed, as we learned from actual descriptions of decadal reunions held during 1798 and 1799, they were essentially modeled after the traditional Sunday gatherings of the church, which they were obviously designed to replace. Kind of makes you think about things like Black Friday going on the calendar, doesn't it? While we're all saying happy holidays instead of Merry Christmas, as all the traditional cultural elements that anchor the lived and shared cycle of our lives in time and space, as all of these are sort of chewed to pieces by the rats that gnaw at the roots of our culture, they're replaced. Now the whole holiday season is about a day in which all kinds of shit is sold cheaply, and the people stampede over one another and crush each other in their attempts to buy consumer garbage. Black Friday. And the introduction of all kinds of new days, and days that will have to go away. Doubtless George Washington's birthday or any days associated with George Washington will have to go away. The only place any of these things will remain is as bank holidays and days when you won't be able to raise anyone on the telephone through calling, service lines or trying to get in touch with the government. That's the only place any of these holidays will be left. Otherwise, they'll all be replaced. It'll be, Tranny reads books to your children in school day. Columbus Day is certainly not long for this world, if it's not gone already. All this shit where they dig into our calendars, it has a history. Look at this. I'm reading to you how they did it in the late 1700s, a bunch of Jacobins, the immediate ancestors of the scumbags we're grappling with today. So anyway, Bishop Henri Gregoire was right when he prophetically told the calendrical reformers back in 1793, Sunday has existed before you, and it will survive you. Long before its official discontinuation, the decadal cult was already dying. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, another fucking rat's nest of commie misadventure. Am I going out of focus? Let's get me into focus so that I can be and remain beautiful. Okay. Sunday has existed before you, said Bishop Henri Gregoire in 1793, and it will survive you. Long before its official discontinuation, the decadal cult was already dying, and following Merlin de Douai's and La Revalière Lepe's resignation from the Directory on June 18, 1799, it all but completely disappeared in many parts of France. However, as a child of the First Republic, the Decade was also destined to die with it, and at least officially it would survive until the appearance of Napoleon Bonaparte on the French national scene. The 7-day week was restored only after the conclusion of the Concordat between Napoleon and the Pope, which essentially re-established the church in France. Just as introducing the Decade was part of a general attempt to de-Christianize France, the restoration of the 7-day week was an integral part of Napoleon's general policy of reconciliation with the church. The failure of the decadal experiment must therefore be understood within the context of the overall failure of the revolution to de-Christianize France. Sorry guys, didn't work. The introduction of the Decade was undoubtedly one of the boldest attempts in history to obliterate the 7-day week. And the years 1793 to 1805 were definitely the darkest days of the latter since having been introduced to the West. The complete failure of this most impressive calendrical adventure ought to teach us a striking lesson about the tremendous resilience of tradition in general and of religion in particular. To further appreciate that lesson, we shall now examine an even more radical attempt made some 140 years later in the Soviet Union to destroy the 7-day week. All right, hopefully everyone can still hear me. We will move on to look at the Непрерывка, which is apparently the name for the Soviet 5-day week. For those of you who may just be jumping in and wondering what the hell's going on, I'm just discussing two historical examples of scumbag Jacobins and Utopians attempting to socially re-engineer our cultures. One of those was the attempt to replace the 2,000-year-oldish 7-day week with a 10-day system called decades in revolutionary France, and the other is this Bolshevik system where they put in a 5-day week. So, thank you all for joining us. Please hit the like button. Please remember to make sure that you are subscribed. And now I will continue reading and discussing this Soviet 5-day Непрерывка. And as soon as I'm done with that, which will be after just a bit here, we will move on to a question and answer phase of this. I expect that this will run until about midnight. Thank you all for bearing with me. And hopefully, I am reading this in such a way that it does not become absolutely boring. So now we discuss the Soviet 5-day Непрерывка. In May 1929, at the 5th Congress of the Soviets of the Union, a major reform of the existing work week, which would involve the introduction of a so-called uninterrupted production week, was proposed by Delegate Larin. I guess I shouldn't do that in a French accent. Was proposed by Delegate Larin. The proposal attracted relatively little attention at the Congress itself, yet Larin soon managed to get Joseph Stalin interested in it. And within a couple of weeks, the Soviet press was already raving about his plan. By June, when Larin's proposal was examined by the Rationalization section of the Supreme Economic Council, the Commissar of Labor, Uglanov, was already its only remaining significant opponent. and by late July, any opposition to the uninterrupted production week was ideologically crushed as counter-revolutionary bureaucratic sabotage. Finally, on August 26, 1929, the Council of People's Commissaries of the Soviet Union officially announced that, starting from October 1st, a major transition of all productive enterprises, as well as offices, from the traditional interrupted work week to a continuous production week would be put into effect. I think I got lost somehow in the midst of that sentence, and my stresses changed in ways they should not. Hopefully you did not end up off the road and lost in the swamp following some sort of will-o'-the-wisp of semantics. A year later, when the Soviet government launched its first 5-year plan, a socialist program of speedy industrialization, maximizing output growth was clearly one of the top items on its agenda. That obviously presupposed exploiting industrial equipment to its utmost, and the authorities resolved to reduce waste by making sure that the expensive machines would be utilized incessantly and never stand idle. Production before everything. The introduction of a continuous working day based on a multiple shift system that allowed production to proceed in an uninterrupted fashion even during nighttime was an obvious product of this new Soviet emphasis on the continuity of industrial production. The traditional work week, however, still involved an unproductive, wasteful weekly day of rest on which the output of the expensive equipment was precisely zero. Hence the various attempts since 1927 to experiment with a continuous work week. These experiments led clearly to the introduction of nepryerivka, uninterrupted, in October 1929. Maximizing output growth must have been Lenin's main objective, as one can tell from the title of his original reform proposal, 300 or 360, which obviously alluded to the prospect of exploiting industrial equipment 60 more days every year. It was also the main rationale provided by the Council of People's Commissaries of the Soviet Union in their decree of August 26, 1929, and yet, if the concern with economic waste were indeed the only factor motivating the calendrical reform, the Soviet authorities could have easily preserved the 7-day week and simply replaced the traditional common weekly day of rest by 7 different days of rest, all staggered vis-a-vis one another. It's almost as though it has something to do, with more than simply keeping production going. It's almost like they want to get rid of Sunday. It's almost like they want to get rid of religion. It's crazy. However, the introduction of a continuous work week turned out to be only one component of an essentially twofold reform of the week. In 1929, a week before the nepryerivka was put into effect, the Council of People's Commissaries of the Soviet Union modified its original decree of August, adding that the new work week would be a 5-day rather than a 7-day cycle, with workers resting every 5th rather than every 7th day. The author continues. To appreciate the anti-religious significance of this move, note that originally the days of the week were even supposed to retain their traditional names, with only Saturday and Sunday being removed from the weekly cycle. Just cut out that troublesome Saturday and Sunday. Then you can keep the names of the week. You can just get rid of Jews worshiping at synagogue. You can just get rid of Christians going to church. Easy, right? A satirical cartoon published in a Russian émigré newspaper from that period shows the same 2 days being shot by a shooting the days? Sorry, that just didn't make sense to me, but I'll read it as is. A satirical cartoon published in a Russian émigré newspaper from that period shows the same 2 days being shot by a Soviet soldier for their bourgeois origins. I guess they were personified as people and then shot in some graphic. These 2 weekly bastions of Judeo-Christian religious sentiments were clearly the main targets of a regime vehemently determined to fulfill the Marxist dream of crushing the opiate of the masses. In fact, when the Commissar of Labor expressed his concern about the future of Sunday, he was told explicitly that the calendrical reform was introduced essentially to combat the religious spirit. Lovely, lovely. As in France 140 years earlier, the main purpose of abolishing the 7-day week in the Soviet Union was to destroy religion there. Altering the length of the weekly cycle was supposed to pull the entire social and economic life of the Soviet Union outside the sphere of relevance of the traditional 7-day rhythm associated with its three major religions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. So, excuse me, so as to make that rhythm of no use for any purpose whatsoever, and thus both obsolete and dispensable. Re-engineer the week, get rid of religion. What other kinds of things are they doing in the background where their proximate target is confusing because it seems tawdry and unimportant, but we can scratch the surface and dig a little deeper and see that the ultimate aim is something much more dramatic, much more overarching, and much more sinister, as we see in this case, where changing the length of the week, renaming the days, changing how human beings interact is designed to completely get rid of an entire religion. Two examples of them doing this kind of crap, going back, what, 200-300 years? 200 years. In a social world where one's most important affairs would all be regulated in accordance with a 5-day rhythm of activity, it would be most difficult to keep track of the traditional 7-day cycle and not lose count of one's days of religious worship. More significantly, only once every 35 days, when the traditional and new weeks would coincide, would a Soviet worker be able to actually attend church on Sunday, mosque on Friday, or synagogue on Saturday. Thus, on any given traditional weekly day of public worship, only 1/5 of the entire Soviet workforce, and not the same people every week, would be able to attend services. The other 80% being at work, because it's not about you and your life. It's all about the collective, comrade. Keeping those factories running. The days of the new weekly cycle were originally supposed to either retain their traditional Monday through Friday names or assume revolutionary names, such as, these are days of the week, people, trade union, Soviet, Lenin, Komsomol, party, hammer, and sickle. Yet very soon, as we saw with decadal, they came to be known simply as first day, second day, and so on. However, on some calendars, as well as on slips indicating to workers the days on which they were off duty, particular days of the week soon also came to be associated with particular colors. The first day of yellow, the second with peach, the third with red, the fourth with purple, and the fifth one with green. It was also not uncommon that, in address books, people would add to the names of friends and acquaintances the color corresponding to the day of the week on which they were off duty. This is something to notice. They broke it up so that different cohorts, these alternating 5 major cohorts, all had different days off for continuous production, but it has this other dimension to it, as we shall see. It's really, I hope you're bearing with me with all the craziness of me reading, but this is important shit if you want to understand what they're doing today. The considerable salience of days off must be understood within the context of the peculiar temporal organization of the Soviet society from October 1929. It was quite understandable that one would become associated with one's regular weekly day off work, since the latter would be shared by only 1/5 of the rest of Soviet society. Soviet workers may have rested more often than their Western counterparts, once every 5 rather than every 7 days, yet they certainly did not rest together as one society, since 80% of the entire Soviet working population would be at work on any given day. In order to guarantee the continuous operation of productive enterprises, the Soviet authorities made a calendrical experiment that was essentially much more radical than the French reform of the week. Rather than merely alter the length of the week from a 7-day cycle to a 5-day one, they essentially tried to destroy the idea of a common societal weekly cycle. And they did so by abolishing the traditional Judeo-Christian institution of a single, uniform weekly day of rest that is commonly shared by the entire society. What we're looking at here is a kind of balkanization. You know, we talk about the atomization of the individual that goes on, and how it splits people apart, removes cooperation, degrades and, you know, seems to be going on a trajectory towards destroying what we call the nuclear family. I have talked about how we have intergenerational atomization, where we have competing cohorts where, you know, the Gen Z kids and the rest don't even understand that there's anything besides boomers. There's them and there's boomers. They don't have Gen X. They vaguely are conscious of millennials, but in any case, everybody's supposed to avoid the other ones. And increasingly, we see the younger ones singling out the older ones as being striking or standing out in some way for how evil they are and the way in which they've saddled the younger generation. I mean, I just saw a thing on Twitter where they had this guy who appeared, I think, on one of these BBC programs, and he's got a posh little accent on him, and he's a young kid, probably, I don't know, 18-ish, somewhere in there, and he's like, you know, they're talking about the people's vote. And in reality, what's going on is it's the dead people's vote, because in the time since that vote was made, they're all gone. You know, it's the dead people's vote. It's shocking. Like, I wouldn't say that I grew up in a situation where there was respect for elders, but it was remembered. And whether people like achieved that ideal of behavior, they at least knew they were supposed to act like they wanted to. And now that's gone. It's the idea that old people must be taken away. It's like fucking Lord of the Flies, you know, smash Piggy's glasses. It's fucking horrifying. So in addition to that kind of balkanization, we can see here, you know, as far back as 1929, they're experimenting with making sure that they can balkanize people and shave off their ability to do anything but focus on their jobs in production lines and at factories and the rest, or in, you know, farm cooperatives. They balkanize them by ensuring that that the entire country doesn't rest at one time. I mean, if anyone wants to like sit there and say it's not really a situation where they're actually trying to do all this, they're intentionally fucking trying to do all this. Now, maybe they're mouthpieces, they're useful idiots like an Alexandria blah blah, like these kind of people. Yeah, they're probably just handed a script, which they obediently, you know, go through the motions of repeating. But the ones behind the scenes, yeah, they know what they're doing. They know exactly what they're doing. And they've had all these experiments in the past that they've undertaken. They just can't seem to get it right. And what I fear most is when the commie and other utopian attempts to socially engineer us come more and more tightly into alignment with biological reality instead of against it. That's what we have to fear the most, because when they start playing these kind of games that I'm reading about and they link them to actual, like, can you imagine if they were trying to put their money on a different part of the table than the idea that gender doesn't exist? Like, we can all be like, we dodged that bullet. What if they started their machinations focusing on that and in ever more subtle ways went after destroying our culture? They're cunning, and they can think on a long line, you know, longitudinally out into the future for their plans. You know, what I call, or Tim used to call, planting black walnut. You know, something further out than a 3 to 5 year exit plan. The only thing that saves us is that they still don't quite know how, you know, the idea of, how do I say this? They think that you need to like basically dam the river and dig a whole new channel and flow all the water into the new channel. And they're very cunning about trying to do that. And just, you know, they're just too clever by half, and they keep stepping on their own dicks. What I'm worried about is when they are just as cunning and they finally realize that, you know, to move a mighty river, it's enough to shift a small pebble far, far upstream. And what I'm worried about is that the Chinese are subtle enough to approach things in that fashion, which is something I may be considering in another clip here at some point. So where was I? Within Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, a single weekly rhythm also involves a single weekly cycle. However, a brief glance at the relations among those religions reminds us that such a state of affairs should not be taken for granted. Even within the Soviet Union itself, Christians, Muslims, and Jews had always adhered to the very same 7-day weekly rhythm, while, at the same time, living in accordance with 3 distinct weekly cycles of activity that would peak on Sunday for Christians, Friday for Muslims, and Saturday for Jews, respectively. Likewise, within contemporary American society, the fact that many restaurants and museum employees are normally off on Mondays ought to remind us that a 7-day work, rest, beat does not necessarily mean having a regular day off on Sundays, but it is a 7-day cycle. The main social theme underlying the introduction of the Neprerivka was the obliteration of temporal symmetry, a traditional form of coordination that involves synchronizing the activities of different individuals so that they would take place together. The Soviet reformers essentially tried to replace temporal symmetry with temporal complementarity, an alternative pattern of coordination which involves staggering the activities of Soviet social life. They replaced the 7-day week by no less than 5 new weeks, which, despite being of the same length, were nevertheless separate cycles that revolved around 5 different weekly days of rest. In short, by introducing the Neprerivka, the Soviet authorities essentially divided the entire society into 5 different working populations, staggered vis-a-vis one another, like the different voices in a polyphonic 5-voice fugue. Seems kind of obvious he should have used the term pentatonic here, but he didn't. The togetherness brought about by temporal symmetry clearly enhances social solidarity, and Soviet workers who shared the same days off work were tied to one another by a special bond, quite like the one that exists among night shift workers. That one would tend to choose one's friends from among those who shared the same days off is quite understandable, particularly given that on days when workers had a day off, only about 20% of the people they knew would be available for socializing, the other 80% being at work. The problems inherent to trying to get together with people whose work schedules are essentially out of phase with one's own are obvious. But think about this, just as an aside. Think about this kind of arrangement with combined with something like the Chinese social credit arrangements. You start to go down in social credit, what does that mean? They just jump you over to another schedule that is offset from those of all your peers, perhaps even your family members by 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. How completely could you cut someone loose from the rest of their society simply by choosing based on an algorithm that has not to do with what you have said that's wrong, but what you might be thinking that's wrong, because they can get all kinds of predictive now, right? Like based on big data, they can Target, for example, can figure one of these companies, Target or Amazon, I can't remember where I read it, but can tell you're pregnant before you are based on what you look at and what you buy, right? What if you have those kinds of systems that are scanning for your behavior online and they say, nothing wrong? It's kind of like when YouTube gives you a warning. They give you a warning and they put you in limited state, not because you've done anything wrong. You haven't done anything wrong. We're just going to fuck you over, but you haven't done anything wrong. We're going to do that because you might do something wrong later. And it's best for everyone. It's best for you. It's best for me. It hurts me as much as it hurts you. Imagine when these kinds of techniques are combined with the information that is available through big data and all the rest. You could cut someone off from everything in their life, including their own family, by putting them onto mandatory work schedules that don't correspond to those enjoyed by all the rest of their family. Imagine, being a father and dealing with a child, before age 7, that whole period where they're kind of doing their thing. And that if you piss somebody off, nothing's going to happen to you other than the fact that you'll be desynchronized from your family's life and won't get to spend those 7 years with your child. I mean, the possibilities are endless. Stomach churning in how nefarious they are. But when you start to look at these historical examples from like the French Revolution and this, what's it fucking called, Neprerivka, combined with something like big data and the Chinese idea of a social credit score, it's really horrifying. However, as indicated by the following complaint, which appeared in the official newspaper Pravda on the very day the Neprerivka was put into effect, such problems were dwarfed by the actual disruption of family life brought about by the reform. What is there for us to do at home if our wives are in the factory, our children at school, and nobody can visit us? It is no holiday if you have to have it alone. So many people. It's no holiday if you have to have it alone. Millennial Woes has been booted from Twitter. Owen Benjamin has been booted from Twitter. Tommy Robinson has been booted from just about everything. It's almost like they're not participating in the same holidays and things. It's just so strange how this historical stuff just kind of winds together in this thread that just seems to have these shared elements. It's so crazy to me. I can't. It is no holiday if you have to have it alone. Some degree of temporal symmetry is necessary for maintaining healthy family relationships. And the new emphasis on temporal complementarity obviously disrupted family life in the Soviet Union. The impossibility of bringing an entire family together other than after a long day's work or for the few annual holidays must have contributed considerably to the erosion of Soviet family life in this period. Must have contributed significantly to the erosion of Soviet family life in this period. I wonder if that was intentional. It couldn't be intentional. It couldn't be. Given the traditional Marxist aversion towards the family, it is quite conceivable that the eventual destruction of the family may have even been on the actual agenda of the architects of the Soviet calendrical reform. Lenin's widow, Nadia Krupskaya, for example, explicitly regarded Sunday family reunions as a good enough reason for abolishing that day. She sounds like she was well adjusted and loved her family. Sounds like she liked her family about as much as I like most of mine. However, even if that had indeed been the case, workers' widespread discontent soon led the authorities to reconsider the matter, and on March 16, 1930, the government commissioned on the Council of Labor and Defense on the transition of enterprises and offices to a continuous production week began recognizing families' requests for synchronized days off of work as a legitimate factor to be considered upon designing work schedules. Thus, in introducing the Nepririvka, the Soviet authorities were probably motivated not only by their wish to maximize output growth, but also by their aversion towards religion, as well as the family. One other motivating factor may have been their inclination toward the divide et impera, divide and rule form of political dominance. The fact that only 20% of the entire Soviet workforce would share a day off together on any given day probably made it most difficult for any serious political organization to get off the ground. That, combined with bread and circuses, that's a winning combination. All right, peoples, we're coming to the close here, and we'll be getting to question and answer. I just have this last little bit. Thank you very much for bearing with me. While many Soviet citizens were rapidly losing count of the days of the 7-day week, even leading official organs such as Pravda did not seem to be able to ignore the traditional cycle and found it necessary to keep printing its days on their mastheads. As in France 140 fucking years earlier, it was essentially traditionalistic rural populations who spearheaded the movement to preserve the 7-day week. Goddamn flyover country. When the authorities insisted that they rest in accordance with the new secular weekly rhythm, many peasants followed the example set by their French predecessors and sabotaged their efforts by taking off both the official days of rest and their traditional weekly days of worship, which they defiantly marked on the official calendars issued by the government's printers. Economic life in the countryside was also still tied to the traditional 7-day rhythm, and throughout the 1930s, Saturday nights could be easily recognized by the heavy traffic of peasants' carts packing the roads on their way to the traditional markets, which were still being held regularly on Sundays. The authorities soon acknowledged their failure to defeat the 7-day week in the countryside when they decided to fix election days on official rest days, which also coincided with Sunday, or in the case of the predominantly Muslim republics of the USSR, with Friday. Getting close to the end, very close to the end, people. The Soviet calendrical adventure finally came to an end on June 26, 1940, when the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet abolished the Chestidnevki and restored the 7-day week. The official rationale offered for the prolongation of the weekly cycle was, not surprisingly, the need to increase production. You get it, right? The whole point was to increase production with this innovation, and they found they had to go back to the old system to increase production. Fucking commies. A closer examination, however, reveals that economic considerations, which had played only one part in the decision to abolish the 7-day week in 1929, were only partly responsible for its restoration in 1940. Given the peasants' success in resisting the government's attempt to secularize the weak, God love flyover country, the Soviet Union was slowly becoming two distinct societies. Ooh. It's almost like putting them on those, cascading and offset schedules introduces a kind of balkanization, much like multiculturalism. And even the Soviet Union had to recognize ultimately that that got in the way of any kind of national cohesion. Ooh, imagine that. As I said, the Soviet Union was slowly becoming two distinct societies, completely out of phase and temporarily uncoordinated with one another. The city living in accordance with the official civil 6-day rhythm, I guess that's 5 days with one off, and the country stubbornly sticking to the traditional religious 7-day cycle. The coexistence of these two conflicting weekly rhythms obviously eroded social solidarity at the societal level, aside from being a most conspicuous testimony of the government's failure to assert its authority. To appreciate the role played by religious sentiments in the downfall of the Chistidnevki, note that, along with their restoration of the 7-day weekly cycle, the Soviet authorities also reestablished Sunday as the official weekly day of rest. Had it not been for powerful religious pressures, which it apparently could not resist, the government could have easily chosen any of the other 6 days of the restored cycle, particularly given the fact that Sunday, the religious associations of which resonate even in its name, Voskresne, I guess is some Russian which I can't pronounce, which literally means resurrection, had officially been dead for almost 11 years. The complete failure of the 11-year Soviet calendrical experiment, just like that of its French predecessor 140 years earlier, attests to the tremendous resilience of tradition in general and of religion in particular. In both France and the Soviet Union, some desperate attempts were made by two of the most ruthless totalitarian regimes in history to completely destroy the Judeo-Christian 7-day week. In both societies to this day, it still remains the dominant beat of social life. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is my discussion of this utopian cultural monkey wrenching of trying to destroy something as old, 2,000 years or more, as our 7-day week. They just can't have it. They just can't have something old and traditional and deeply seated and shared across the West like that. Now shared across the world with the synchronization of the various calendrical systems. And yet they lost. One can only hope, one can only imagine that the rest of their hair-brained, addle-pated bullshit schemes will likewise fail.